Hello friends and welcome back. Please support my channel. Like this video and subscribe the channel. Let's start the amazing episode. The whisper that started it all. It began quietly, almost too quietly to matter at first. Just a name, Serena. A name none of the wives had ever heard before, yet one that would soon detonate through their lives with the force of something long buried finally breaking free. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper in the margins of suspicion, a faint unease that couldn't quite be explained. But whispers, when ignored, have a way of growing teeth. Serena was young, late 20s, striking in a way that commanded attention without asking for it. Smooth black hair that fell like silk, sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to study everything, and a social media presence that suggested influence, confidence, and a carefully curated life of serenity and success. To the outside world, she was just another wellness influencer, someone posting about healing, balance, and spiritual growth. But to the women whose lives were about to unravel, she would become something far more dangerous. The first real crack appeared in something as ordinary as a financial record. Christine noticed it before anyone else. She had always been attentive to the details, the quiet keeper of things that others might overlook. So when she saw $7,400 missing from their shared real estate account, labeled vaguely as a wellness retreat, it didn't sit right with her. The description was too neat, too clean, like a label meant to avoid questions rather than answer them. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a business expense. Maybe Kody had mentioned it and she had simply forgotten. But something in her gut refused to settle. That night, as the house fell into its usual quiet rhythm, Christine found herself scrolling through Instagram, not with purpose, but with instinct guiding her. And then she saw it. A post from a yoga studio. Soft lighting. Neutral tones. Serenity staged to perfection. But it wasn't the setting that made her breath catch, it was the people in the frame. There, wrapped in a white robe, smiling softly for the camera, was Serena. And beside her, close enough to suggest intimacy, was a man whose presence Christine recognized instantly. Kody. At first, her mind resisted what her eyes were telling her. It searched for explanations, angles, coincidences, misunderstandings. But then came the other photos. More candid, less controlled. His arm draped across Serena's back. A moment frozen mid-laughter. And then one image that had clearly been deleted too late, a kiss, captured just long enough to be seen, but not erased quickly enough to disappear. Christine felt something inside her drop, like the ground beneath her had suddenly given way. The pieces didn't just fail to fit, they formed a picture she had never imagined she would have to see. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she acted. Within the hour, she was in her car, driving through the quiet streets toward Janelle's house. The screenshots sat heavy on her phone, like evidence she didn't want but couldn't ignore. When Janelle opened the door, one look at Christine's face was enough to know something was wrong. No words were needed at first. Just the silent exchange of understanding before Christine handed over the phone. Janelle scrolled slowly, her expression tightening with each image. She wasn't someone who reacted impulsively, but even she couldn't hide the shift in her demeanor. By the time she reached the final photo, the room felt different, heavier, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Before either could fully process what they were seeing, the phone rang. It was Mary. Her voice came through strained, controlled in a way that suggested she was holding something back. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She had received a hotel confirmation, Kody's name, booked alongside a woman. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. The pattern was forming. Meanwhile, somewhere else entirely, Robin was having her own moment of realization. It came not through numbers or photos, but through something more intimate, something closer to instinct. A scent. A perfume that wasn't hers, lingering faintly on Kody's clothes. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Then came the detail she couldn't ignore, a long, blonde hair. Not hers. Not anyone's she could explain away. And finally, the discovery that would tie everything together, a velvet ring box, tucked away in Kody's truck as if it had been hidden in haste. Inside, engraved with quiet permanence, were the words, "To my moon, forever." That night, Robin didn't call ahead. She didn't text. She simply showed up at Christine's house, the ring box in her hand like a piece of undeniable truth. When the door opened, she stepped inside without a word. And there they were, 4 women, bound for years by a shared life, now standing together on the edge of something entirely different. No cameras. No staged conversations. Just silence, thick with realization. Christine had the photos. Janelle had the financial discrepancy. Mary had the hotel confirmation. Robin had the ring. Individually, each piece was troubling. Together, they formed something undeniable. A storm was coming. Janelle, ever the strategist, was the first to move beyond the emotional weight of the moment. Within hours, she had contacted an accountant, someone she trusted, someone discreet. If there was something hidden in their finances, she intended to find it. What came back was worse than any of them had anticipated. Transfers. Multiple, consistent, and carefully disguised. Money moving from their shared accounts into one destination, accounts linked to Serena. Not small amounts, either. Significant sums. Enough to suggest not just carelessness, but intention. There were records of high-end trips, luxury expenses, even invoices from what appeared to be a wedding planner. The room fell silent again as the implications settled in. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Through a contact in Sedona, Christine managed to obtain something that shifted the entire situation from betrayal to something far more serious, a marriage license. Filed quietly. Recently. The names on it read, Kody Brown and Serena Walker. And the witness signature? Robin Brown. Except it wasn't Robin. Not really. The signature was there, but it wasn't hers. Forged. That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. It wasn't even just financial misconduct. This was something else, something legal, something dangerous. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the 4 women had reached a decision. They weren't going to confront him privately. They weren't going to keep it within the family. They were going to fight. Together. The lawsuit that shook everything morning didn't bring clarity. It didn't soften the shock or dull the betrayal. If anything, the light of day only made everything sharper, more real, more unavoidable. What had been discovered the night before no longer felt like fragments of suspicion. It had solidified into truth. And truth, once seen, demanded action. The 4 women moved with a quiet, synchronized resolve that none of them had ever shared before. For years, they had existed within a complicated structure, sometimes united, often divided, frequently navigating tension that never fully disappeared. But this was different. This wasn't about jealousy or imbalance or emotional neglect. This was about deception on a scale that cut through every layer of their lives, personal, financial, and legal. They met early, long before the world outside had fully awakened. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just focus. Christine organized the digital evidence, printing every image, every time-stamped post, every screenshot that captured moments Kody likely believed would remain hidden. Janelle compiled the financial records, each transaction laid out in cold, undeniable detail. Mary brought the hotel confirmations and communication logs, her hands steady despite the weight of what they represented. And Robin. Robin carried the ring box, along with the quiet devastation of knowing her identity had been used as a tool in something she had never agreed to. By mid-morning, they were walking into a law office. The building itself was unremarkable, clean lines, neutral colors, the kind of place designed to project calm authority. But what they carried inside those walls would ignite something far from calm. The receptionist barely had time to process who they were before they were ushered into a conference room, where a team of attorneys was already assembling. They hadn't come unprepared. What followed was not an emotional outburst, but a strategic unveiling. Piece by piece, they laid everything on the table. Photos, financial statements, legal documents, the marriage license, the forged signature. Each item shifted the atmosphere in the room, turning curiosity into concern and concern into something far more serious. The attorneys listened carefully, asking precise questions, examining each document with trained scrutiny. What might have sounded unbelievable in casual conversation became something entirely different when backed by evidence. Patterns emerged, intent became visible, and the legal implications began to take shape. Fraud, identity misuse, financial misappropriation, potential bigamy. Each term landed with weight, transforming the situation from a personal betrayal into a case that could carry real consequences. When the lead attorney finally spoke, her tone was measured but firm. This wasn't just viable, it was strong. Strong enough to pursue aggressively. Strong enough to win. Christine was the first to respond. Her voice didn't shake. "We're not here to scare him," she said. "We're here to hold him accountable." One by one, the others nodded. There would be no turning back. Over the next 48 hours, the legal team worked with relentless efficiency. Documents were drafted, charges outlined, timelines constructed. Every detail was cross-checked, every claim supported. The case grew rapidly, expanding beyond what even the women had initially imagined. 5 counts of financial fraud, 2 counts of identity misuse, claims of emotional abuse tied to coercion and manipulation, and additional violations tied to the misuse of shared business structures. Each woman formally signed on. Christine first, decisive, unwavering. Janelle next, methodical, certain. Mary followed, quiet but resolute. And finally, Robin, her signature carrying a different kind of weight, one shaped by betrayal that cut deeper than the rest. By the time the documents were complete, the case was no longer just theirs. It was something that would soon belong to the public. And the public was more than ready. The story broke faster than anyone could have predicted. One outlet picked it up, then another, then dozens more. Headlines spread like wildfire, each one more explosive than the last. The idea of a hidden fifth marriage, combined with allegations of fraud and deception, was too compelling to ignore. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media platforms lit up with speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Hashtags began trending globally, pulling in millions of reactions. Online forums dissected every known detail, users piecing together timelines and theories with obsessive intensity. What had once been a controlled narrative was now completely out of anyone's hands. Kody said nothing. No statement. No denial. No attempt to get ahead of the story. And that silence spoke volumes. Because behind that silence was something far more telling. He knew. He knew what they had. He knew how much had been uncovered. And perhaps most importantly, Serena knew too. The illusion she had been living in began to crack under the weight of reality. What she had believed to be a relationship built on honesty now revealed itself as something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The man she had trusted was no longer just a partner. He was a liability. But by then, it was too late for quiet exits or private resolutions. The lawsuit had been filed, and the next step would make everything undeniably real. It happened at dawn. The air was still, the kind of quiet that usually belongs to ordinary mornings. But there was nothing ordinary about what was about to unfold. A process server approached the front door of Kody's home with a thick envelope in hand, a collection of documents that represented the beginning of the end. Inside, Kody was unaware of how drastically his life was about to change. He answered the door casually, coffee still in hand, expecting nothing more than another routine interruption. But the moment the envelope was placed in his hands, something shifted. The weight of it was immediate, not physical, but symbolic. He didn't need to open it to understand. But he did anyway. The first page was enough. The language was clear, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. Fraud, identity misuse, misappropriation of funds, legal action initiated by all 4 wives. His face drained of color as the words settled in. Behind him, Serena watched, confusion quickly giving way to realization as she pieced together what was happening. The life she had stepped into, one that had seemed stable, even promising, was unraveling in real time. Outside, the world was already catching up. News crews began to gather, cameras positioning themselves for the first glimpse of a man now at the center of a rapidly escalating scandal. Strangers lingered nearby, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic pull of public downfall. Signs appeared, some in support of the women, others demanding answers. The narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer a private matter. It was a spectacle. And at the center of it all was a man who had once controlled every aspect of his story, now watching as it was rewritten without him. Inside, Kody stood frozen, the legal documents trembling slightly in his hand. For years, he had navigated complexity with confidence, believing he could manage every relationship, every detail, every secret. But this was different. This was something he couldn't talk his way out of, couldn't charm away, couldn't control. Because for the first time, the four women he had once relied on to remain separate, divided, and manageable had done something he never expected. They had united, and that unity had become his greatest threat. As the sun rose higher, casting light across a scene that would soon dominate headlines everywhere, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just the beginning of a legal battle. It was the beginning of a collapse. When the courtroom became a battleground by the time the first court date arrived, the story had already taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a private unraveling had transformed into a full-scale public spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse before sunrise, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like silent witnesses waiting to broadcast every moment. Reporters clustered behind barricades, rehearsing their live intros, while photographers adjusted lenses in anticipation of the first glimpse of the people at the center of it all. Crowds gathered too, not just curious onlookers, but people who had followed the family for years, now drawn to what felt like the final, explosive chapter. Some held signs in support of the women. Others simply watched, phones in hand, ready to capture history as it unfolded. Inside, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. The courtroom carried a weight that no headline could fully convey. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as if the room itself understood the gravity of what was about to take place. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't a scripted episode. This was real. And the consequences would be permanent. The legal team representing the four women had already established a reputation in the days leading up to the hearing. Quietly but efficiently, they had assembled a case so detailed that even seasoned observers were beginning to take notice. Boxes of evidence lined their table, documents, printed communications, financial records, and certified filings, all organized with precision. Every piece had a purpose. Every detail had a place. And together, they formed something formidable. When the doors finally opened, the room filled quickly. Every seat was taken, and even the standing areas along the walls became crowded. There were no cameras allowed inside, but that didn't stop the constant stream of updates being relayed to the outside world. Then, one by one, the women entered. Christine came first. Dressed in a simple navy suit, she walked with quiet focus, her expression unreadable. There were no tears, no outward signs of the emotional storm she had endured. Only determination. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge the whispers. Her gaze remained fixed straight ahead. Janelle followed closely behind, carrying a stack of neatly organized files. Her demeanor was calm, almost clinical, as if she had already compartmentalized everything she needed to do. Where others might have faltered under pressure, she seemed to grow steadier. Mary entered next, her posture strong, her chin slightly raised. There was something resolute in the way she moved, as though she had reached a point where fear no longer had any hold on her. Her eyes scanned the room briefly, taking everything in. And finally, Robin. She arrived last, dressed in black, her face partially shielded by dark sunglasses. There was a pause as she stepped inside, a moment where the room seemed to take a collective breath. Then she moved forward, slower than the others, but no less certain. For women, no longer divided, no longer uncertain, standing together. Across the room, Kody sat beside his attorney. He looked different. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be captured in a single image, But in the small details, the restless tapping of his fingers against the table, the way his shoulders slouched just slightly more than usual, the tension visible in his jaw. He avoided looking directly at the women, instead focusing on the papers in front of him as if they might offer some form of escape. They didn't. When the judge entered, the shift in the room was immediate. Conversation ceased. Movement stilled. The energy transformed from chaotic anticipation into something controlled, deliberate. Court is now in session. The words echoed with finality. This was no longer about speculation. This was about evidence. Procedure began with formalities, but it didn't take long before the case itself came into focus. As names were called, each woman stood when prompted, their voices steady as they acknowledged their presence. "Present, Your Honor." Each response carried weight, not just as a procedural necessity, but as a declaration. They were here. They weren't backing down. And they were ready. Christine was called to the stand first. As she took her seat, the room seemed to lean in collectively. There was an unspoken understanding that what she said next would set the tone for everything that followed. Her voice, when she began, was calm, measured. But beneath that calm was something unmistakable, strength forged through betrayal. She didn't start with accusations. She started with context. She spoke about the years they had built together, the trust that had been foundational to everything they shared. She described the gradual shift, the moments that didn't quite make sense at the time but now formed a pattern in hindsight. And then she spoke about the discovery. The photos. The realization. The moment everything changed. He didn't just lie, she said, her voice steady but firm. He created an entirely separate life and used our trust to hide it. The words landed heavily. There was no dramatics in her delivery, no attempt to exaggerate. And that made it all the more powerful. She continued, moving into the financial impact. The shared accounts. The savings intended for their children's futures. The properties they had invested in together. All of it, she explained, had been quietly redirected, siphoned away under the guise of legitimate expenses. "We believed we were building something secure," she said. "But we were funding something we didn't even know existed." At the defense table, Kody shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, he looked up. But Christine didn't look back. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment longer than expected, as if no one quite wanted to break the weight of what had just been said. Then came Janelle. If Christine's testimony had established the emotional foundation of the case, Janelle's would define its structure. She approached the stand with the same composed precision she had carried into the courtroom, placing her files neatly in front of her before beginning. Where Christine had spoken in narrative, Janelle spoke in facts. Numbers. Timelines. Documentation. She outlined the structure of their shared business entities, explaining how funds were meant to flow, how investments were recorded, how decisions were typically made. Then she showed how those systems had been bypassed. Transaction by transaction, she traced the movement of money. Large sums transferred without proper authorization. Expenses labeled in ways that obscured their true purpose. Payments linked directly to accounts associated with Serena. There was no room for ambiguity. And then she introduced the emails. Printed, time-stamped, verified. In them, Kody instructed her to categorize certain expenses under misleading labels, phrases that would make them appear legitimate for tax and business purposes. The effect was immediate. A murmur spread through the courtroom before being quickly silenced by the judge. Janelle didn't react. She simply continued. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she said. "It was a system." The distinction mattered. Because systems imply planning, intent, and control. By the time she stepped down, the tone of the trial had shifted. This was no longer a case built on emotional testimony alone. It was a case supported by structure, evidence, and undeniable patterns. Next came Mary. Where Christine had been steady and Janelle precise, Mary brought something different: raw, unfiltered impact. She carried a small notebook with her as she took the stand. At first, it seemed insignificant. But when she opened it, the room quickly realized what it contained. Her voice was softer than the others, but no less powerful. She began reading. Entries written over months. Years, even. Thoughts she had never intended for anyone else to hear. She spoke of distance, emotional, physical, and psychological. Of a relationship that had slowly eroded while she was being told that things were improving. Of promises that were made but never kept. And then she read the entry that changed everything. "I used to believe we were rebuilding," she said, her voice catching just slightly. "But now I see he was building something else entirely." The courtroom was silent again. Not the tense silence of anticipation, but something deeper. Something that felt almost reflective. Even those who had come expecting drama found themselves confronted with something far more real. Pain. Loss. And the quiet devastation of realizing it had all been based on deception. When Mary stepped down, she didn't look at Kody. Not once. And then, finally, it was Robin's turn. The room seemed to hold its breath. Because Robin's testimony wasn't just about betrayal. It was about something else entirely. Something legal. Something that could change the trajectory of the entire case. She approached the stand slowly, the velvet ring box in her hand. When she sat down, she placed it gently in front of her before opening it. "This," she said, her voice steady despite the weight behind it, "was never meant for me." Inside, the engraved message caught the light. A quiet declaration of something that had been hidden in plain sight. Then she shifted. From the emotional to the factual. She described how she had discovered the marriage license. How something about it hadn't felt right. How she had examined the signature, the one bearing her name. "It wasn't mine," she said. The words were simple. But the impact was anything but. Because with that statement, the case crossed a line it hadn't crossed before. From civil into something potentially criminal. The judge leaned forward slightly, requesting the document be brought forward for examination. What followed would take time, analysis, verification, expert input. But even before those processes began, one thing was clear. The stakes had just risen. Significantly. And as the first day of trial came to a close, the energy in the courtroom was no longer just tense. It was charged. Because what had started as a story of betrayal was now evolving into something far more serious. Something that could carry consequences beyond financial restitution. Something that could change lives permanently. As people filed out, voices hushed but urgent, one question lingered in every conversation. How much deeper did this go? When everything began to collapse by the second week of trial, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed. What had once felt like tension had evolved into something heavier, inevitable. The early uncertainty was gone, replaced by a growing sense that the truth was no longer hiding in fragments. It was surfacing piece by piece, and with each passing hour, it became harder to contain. The courtroom lights seemed harsher now, casting sharp edges across every expression, every movement. Even the smallest reactions carried weight. Reporters no longer whispered casually, they watched closely, typing with urgency, aware that every detail mattered. Because the case was no longer just unfolding. It was tightening. Christine returned to the stand first under cross-examination. The defense attempted to shift the narrative, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting misinterpretations, hinting at emotional bias. But Christine remained composed. She didn't argue. She didn't over-explain. She answered only what was asked, her voice controlled, her focus unbroken. Still, there was one moment that pierced through her composure. A question about the rumors. Specifically, whispers that had begun circulating shortly before the lawsuit, rumors that Serena might be pregnant. For a fraction of a second, Christine hesitated. Then she answered. "Yes," she said quietly. "I heard that." The courtroom stirred. Because that detail, small as it might have seemed, carried enormous weight. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about the possibility that while still legally entangled in one life, Kody had already begun building another. A new family. A new future. While leaving the old one in pieces. The defense moved on quickly, but the impact lingered. Next came Janelle. If Christine had been steady, Janelle was unshakable. She returned to the stand with the same structured clarity, but this time she brought something new in email. Printed. Dated. Verified. The prosecutor asked her to read it aloud. She adjusted the paper slightly, her voice calm but firm as she began. Once the money is transferred, we can move to Utah and never look back. Don't worry, the wives will survive. The words echoed through the courtroom. No one moved. No one spoke. Because in that single sentence, years of shared life had been reduced to an afterthought. Decades of commitment, dismissed with casual indifference. The judge leaned forward. Please read that again for the record. Janelle did. Slower this time. Deliberate. Letting every word land exactly where it needed to. At the defense table, Kody sat motionless, his expression tightening, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead but clearly unfocused. For the first time, it wasn't just the evidence that spoke. It was his own words. And they were impossible to explain away. Then came Mary. Her second appearance on the stand carried a different kind of weight. Where her first testimony had revealed emotional truth, this time she brought something more personal, something raw. She opened her notebook again. But instead of reading broadly, she turned to one specific entry. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I used to pray for him, she read. Now I pray to forget him. The effect was immediate. A visible shift passed through the room, subtle, but undeniable. Even those trained to remain detached seemed affected. A clerk reached for a tissue. Someone in the gallery lowered their head. Because this wasn't strategy. This was loss. And it made everything else feel even more real. But the moment that truly altered the trajectory of the trial came next. Robin returned to the stand. This time, there was no hesitation in her movements, no trace of uncertainty. Whatever internal conflict she had once carried had been replaced by clarity. She wasn't here as a reluctant participant anymore. She was here as a witness. And what she revealed would change everything. She explained, in precise detail, how her digital signature had been used. Not guessed. Not approximated. Taken. Lifted from a legitimate document, a tax form filed years earlier, and then inserted into the marriage license using basic editing software. The courtroom fell silent. Not the kind of silence that follows surprise, but the kind that follows confirmation. Because this wasn't speculation anymore. It was proof. A forensic analyst took the stand shortly after, walking through the technical process step by step. The comparison between the original signature and the one on the license was displayed clearly. Line curvature, pressure patterns, pixel structure. They matched, but not in a way that suggested authenticity. In a way that suggested duplication, manipulation, intent. The judge's expression hardened as the explanation concluded. Because now, the case had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer just about civil wrongdoing. This was about potential criminal action. And then, just as the courtroom began to absorb that reality, something unexpected happened. A surprise witness was called. A private investigator. Hired weeks before the lawsuit had even been filed. The room shifted again as he took the stand, his demeanor calm, professional, unshaken by the attention. What he presented wasn't theory. It was footage. Video evidence. The lights dimmed slightly as a screen was brought into focus. And then it began. Kody and Serena entering a real estate office together. Casual. Comfortable. Familiar. Audio followed. Kody referring to Serena as my legal wife. A murmur rippled through the room. Then another clip. An escrow conversation. Kody describing himself as unattached, except for what he dismissed as a paperwork matter. And then the final piece. A voicemail. His voice. Clear. Unfiltered. Delete this after you hear it. I think the judge is sniffing around our accounts. The reaction was immediate. Voices rose. Movement broke the stillness. The judge struck the gavel sharply, calling for order, but even that took a moment to settle the room. Because what had just been shown wasn't just damaging. It was devastating. The defense attempted to request a recess. It was denied. Mr. Brown, the judge said firmly, you are not in control here. The words landed with unmistakable authority. And with that, the balance of the courtroom shifted completely. No longer was this a case built on opposing narratives. It had become something else. Something clearer. something harder to dispute. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Kody took the stand. The room seemed to contract as he stood, every eye following him as he moved forward. For weeks, he had remained behind the defense table, reacting, responding, absorbing. Now he had to speak. Under oath. His lawyer began carefully, guiding him through questions designed to frame his actions in a more sympathetic light. Stress, emotional confusion, complexity of relationships. Kody leaned into it. "I didn't intend to hurt anyone," he said. "I just followed my heart." The words hung in the air. But they didn't land the way he expected. Because this time, they weren't enough. Under cross-examination, the tone shifted immediately. Direct. Precise. Unforgiving. "Did you forge Robin's signature on the marriage license submitted to the state of Nevada?" The question was clear, simple, and unavoidable. Kody paused. Not briefly, but long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "I don't remember," he said finally. The response triggered immediate reaction. The prosecutor stepped forward, placing two documents side by side, the question's signature and a verified sample. "Do these look identical to you?" Kody shifted in his seat. His earlier composure was slipping now, replaced by something more visible: pressure. When pressed further about the financial structure, the shell company, the redirected funds, he attempted to minimize it. "It was a placeholder business," he said. The judge leaned forward. A placeholder business that received over $100,000 in a single year? No answer came, because there wasn't one that could hold. And then came the moment that sealed it. The prosecutor introduced a message, sent by Kody, to Serena. "Don't worry. Robin's signature won't raise any issues. She signs everything I present to her." The courtroom froze. Because that single message did what hours of testimony had been building toward. It established intent, premeditation, knowledge. Kody tried to deflect, to reframe it as sarcasm. But the attempt fell flat, because nothing about the context supported that claim. And for the first time since the trial began, he had no explanation, only silence. As the day came to an end, the weight of everything that had been revealed settled heavily over the room. This was no longer a matter of interpretation. No longer a question of perspective. It was evidence. Clear, connected, and increasingly impossible to escape. And as Kody stepped down from the stand, one thing had become undeniable. The foundation he had built his life on wasn't just cracking. It was collapsing. The verdict that ended everything. By the time the final day of testimony arrived, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of debate. It felt like a place of conclusion. Every seat was filled long before proceedings began. The air carried a dense, almost suffocating stillness, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something irreversible. Reporters sat poised, fingers hovering over keyboards. Legal analysts leaned forward in quiet anticipation. Even the occasional whisper felt out of place, quickly swallowed by the weight of the moment. At the center of it all sat Kody. Gone was the restless tapping, the shifting posture, the attempts to appear composed. What remained was something far more telling: stillness. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his gaze lowered, his expression drained of the confidence that had once defined him. He didn't look toward the gallery. He didn't look toward the women. He simply waited. Across the room, the four women sat together. Not as they once had, bound by obligation or expectation, but as something else entirely. There was no need for words between them. What they had endured, what they had revealed, what they had stood through together had already reshaped everything. Their posture carried quiet strength. Their presence spoke louder than anything they might have said. When the judge entered, the entire room rose as one. And then, silence. A silence so complete it seemed to press in from all sides. The judge took her seat slowly, a stack of documents placed carefully before her. She adjusted her glasses, glanced briefly across the courtroom, and then began. "This case," she said, her voice measured but firm, "has presented one of the most complex intersections of personal relationships and legal accountability this court has encountered." No one moved. No one dared. Because every word mattered. She began outlining the findings methodically, one point at a time. Fraudulent use of shared financial accounts proven. Misappropriation of funds through layered transactions substantiated. Identity misuse through forged documentation confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. Each statement landed like a tolling bell, echoing through the room with unmistakable finality. Kody didn't look up, but the color drained further from his face. The judge continued, addressing the broader impact, the emotional and psychological toll that had been laid bare throughout the trial. This court recognizes, she said, her gaze shifting briefly toward the women, that the harm in this case extends beyond financial loss. It includes the systematic erosion of trust, autonomy, and personal dignity. A pause. Then, more quietly, you are not merely plaintiffs in a civil matter. You are survivors of sustained deception. At those words, something shifted. Christine's hand moved instinctively, finding Robin's beneath the table. Janelle exhaled slowly, her composure holding, but softening at the edges. Mary closed her eyes briefly, as if allowing the weight of validation to finally settle. For the first time, it wasn't just about proving what had happened. It was about being seen. Fully. Clearly. And then the judge continued. And this court cannot ignore the evidence presented that indicates potential violations beyond the scope of civil liability. The room tensed. Because everyone understood what that meant. The shift from civil consequence to criminal implication. The judge's tone sharpened slightly as she proceeded. Based on the findings, this court is referring the matter for criminal review, including, but not limited to, document falsification, misrepresentation of marital status across jurisdictions, and potential financial misconduct subject to further investigation. A ripple moved through the courtroom, quiet but electric. This wasn't just a ruling. It was escalation. And then came the moment no one had fully prepared for. The judge raised the gavel. "Mr. Brown," she said, her voice unwavering, "in light of the findings and pending further action, you are to be remanded into custody." For a fraction of a second, time seemed to stop. Then the gavel struck. The sound was sharp, final, undeniable. A collective gasp swept through the room, breaking the silence that had held for so long. Reporters surged into motion. Pens moved. Screens lit up. The outside world, waiting just beyond those walls, was about to erupt. But inside, everything slowed. A bailiff stepped forward. "Sir, please stand." Kody didn't move immediately. His eyes lifted for the first time, scanning the room as if searching for something, someone. A moment of recognition. A gesture. A defense. Nothing came. Not from his attorney. Not from Serena, seated quietly in the back. And not from the women. Especially not from them. Because whatever had once connected them had been severed long before this moment. Slowly, almost mechanically, Kody stood. The sound of cuffs closing around his wrists was unmistakable. Cold. Metallic. Final. It echoed louder than it should have, or maybe it only felt that way because of everything it represented. Not just restraint, but consequence. Not just an ending, but accountability. The judge spoke once more, her voice carrying across the stunned room. This case is not about the structure of personal relationships. It is about the unlawful actions taken within them. There was nothing left to add. As Kody was escorted toward the exit, the doors opened and a flood of light poured in, camera flashes igniting like bursts of lightning. Outside, the crowd had grown, voices rising in a mix of outrage, support, disbelief. But inside, the moment remained grounded. Still. Heavy. The four women did not rush to leave. They remained seated for a few seconds longer, allowing the reality of what had just happened to settle around them. No celebration. No dramatic reaction. Just breath. Just presence. Then, quietly, they stood. Christine turned first, her expression calm but resolute. She reached for Mary, pulling her into a brief, tight embrace. Janelle placed a steady hand on Robin's shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity. No words were needed, because everything had already been said, through evidence, through testimony, through standing together when it mattered most. They walked out not as they once had, not as a fractured family, but as individuals who had reclaimed something that had been taken from them: control, truth, and the right to define what came next. They exited through a side door, avoiding the chaos waiting outside. The noise of the crowd faded behind them as they stepped into a quieter space, the weight of the courtroom finally beginning to lift. Not completely, maybe not ever, but enough to breathe. Back inside, the courtroom slowly emptied. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Papers were gathered. The intensity of the moment began to dissolve into aftermath. A clerk organizing documents near the bench paused and glanced toward a colleague. "This," she said softly, "is going to be remembered." And she was right. Because what had unfolded in that room was more than a legal battle. It was the unraveling of control, the exposure of truth, and the closing of a chapter that had, for too long, been written by one voice alone. Now, that story belonged to the women who had lived it, and finally had spoken it. Episode is over. Thanks to watching this video and support to my channel. Please subscribe the channel if you don't do it. Next episode are coming very soon.